Okay, so let's talk about some other types of political crimes that get committed by kind of the larger body, by the government. Because one kind of big category of crimes that you could put into this category are also things that we would call patriarchal crimes. And when you're talking about a patriarchal crime and you're talking about it at this scale of a crime committed by the government, you're talking about offenses and types of behavior that are considered crimes against usually women and children as part of a system that is traditionally dominated by and authorized by men. So, there are some parts of the world where they've basically put into practice, into law, um, activities that uh, got kind of initiated and instituted by a male dominated hierarchy that are designed kind of to control and manipulate and sometimes, damage women for the sake of things like preserving virginity, um, etc. So, you know, not a lot, a lot of these things are kind of implicitly sanctioned by the governments in the countries, run by men. And the idea being that these things are kind of in place to preserve the basically traditional patriarchal order, male dominance and authority. So, just to give you some examples of things that would fit into this category. In China, in the 1970s and really up through today, they've experienced and were experiencing a few decades ago an extreme population explosion. And population experts warned people in China that if they didn't try to restrict the amount of children that families were having, they were going to become overpopulated and completely exhaust all of their resources. So China came up with, in the 1970s and 1980s, what they called their One Child Policy Act, in which they actually mandated that families were only allowed to have one child. Well, the problem with that is it was preferred in Chinese culture and in many cultures to have a son, to have a boy, to carry on the family name. Children tend to be considered kind of a burden because you usually have to provide them with some kind of a dowry, some kind of uh, a thing to marry them off to, and basically once they grow up, they are no longer going to be primarily a part of your family in traditional Chinese culture. They are going to enter into their husband's family. So families over time in China systematically um, were killing newborn baby girls so that they could have room to have a boy baby. So the amount of infanticide that occurred as a result of this policy that kind of got enacted by the Chinese government skyrocketed in the 1980s and 90s to the point now where they have an extreme overpopulation of men. Another example would be in India. One of the problems that is a very related idea. The fact that in India, a bride upon marriage is expected to have a certain amount of goods, monies, wealth that she's bringing into her new family. Well, again, in India, with their extreme population explosion, especially in the past couple decades, it became just kind of an economic issue for families to want to just have boy babies. So again, you have this kind of patriarchal system where women are expected to bring all these possessions and wealth with them to marriages. Men aren't necessarily expected to have kind of a similar obligation. So families are going to want to have boy babies, and the result of that has happened in a couple different ways. One of which is again infanticide, purposely systematically killing a large number of newborn girl babies. But they have also had issues with what we would call bride burning, which essentially means that a man would marry a woman just for her dowry, and then either the idea being set fire to her, but kill her immediately after marriage. So in many of countries, women still bring a dowry with them upon marriage, and having too many daughters causes economic strain. So it's kind of an example of these implicit kind of patriarchal rules that are structured into their culture that have resulted in systematically over time these these crimes. So excuse me. In the Middle East, they have a phenomenon called honor killings. So essentially, when a female member of a Middle Eastern family becomes a rape victim, gets raped, sometimes they're killed by their families because the perception is that they've brought their family dishonor. Um, So it kind of isn't really the response that maybe a lot of people in America would think about happening after a female in a family gets raped. People don't tend to think of that as being something that is necessarily the woman's fault in a lot of circumstances. But in certain cultures in the Middle East, becoming a rape victim can actually result in a woman being killed in her family to preserve the honor of the family. And in some countries in Africa, we know that within the culture, it is considered a rite of passage, just a part of normal girl development, to remove a girl's kind of external female genitalia. So the idea being that as a girl enters into puberty, she needs to be cleansed. She needs to be removed of any outward external sexual organs as a part of her maturation. So they have systematically over time engaged in female genital mutilation. I've abbreviated that FGM. Oftentimes resulting in these women not being able to have children or dying as a result of the procedures. Again, and we call all of these things patriarchal crimes because it's an example of kind of implicitly sanctioned behaviors run by men, kind of all geared towards and unfortunately victimizing females within their population. So in diplomacy, in international kind of diplomacy, we've developed these kind of conventions to deal with some of these potential ways that governments can commit political crimes. So a convention in diplomacy doesn't hold the same meaning that it normally does. When you think of a convention, you kind of think of an assembly of people. All that a convention means in the diplomatic world means an international agreement. So the Geneva Convention and the protocols that have come from it is actually just a series. There have been four of them now, a series of four treaties and three additional kind of protocols that we have currently, in international law that establish standards of law for the humanitarian treatment of people and victims of war. So some examples of things that are protocols from the Geneva Conventions. So the last time that they kind of got updated really was 1949 after World War II. And some examples of some protocols that are in some of the Geneva Conventions would be prohibiting things like chemical, biological weapons. If it gets found out that you use those in the course of, combat, in the course of action within your own country, that's something that can be a violation. As a government, you can be subject to extreme penalties. It's in the Geneva Conventions that we have written in protection of victims of international armed conflicts. So this would be an example of somebody who surrenders and becomes a prisoner of war. We have certain protections against people who are prisoners of war in the care of another country. And protection of victims in non-international armed conflicts. So this would be an example of protection of people, just citizens of a country. So some other examples of protocols that have been on the books since the 1920s. There's a protocol banning the use of asphyxiating, poisonous, or other gases. Obviously, in World War II, that ended up coming into question. And violation of any of these protocols that are in the Geneva Convention is seen as a crime by the government of that nation. So you guys have all probably heard of the Geneva Convention. Obviously, one of the biggest examples of a crime by the government that has gotten some governments into a great deal of trouble would be the crime of genocide. Genocide just meaning, mass destruction, annihilation of populations within a country. So on the map that I'm showing you here, what I just wanted you to see is the different countries that have signed and ratified the Convention on Genocide. So there's a convention that as a country, if you want to enter into it, you have to abide by certain conventions protocols for for not engaging in genocide, essentially. And obviously not every country in the world has signed the convention. So the countries that are in light green on the map are places that have signed and ratified their participation in the Convention on Genocide. Obviously you can see that's the United States, most of the Asian continent, South America, Europe. The dark green areas have either acceded or seceded from the convention, and the yellow, there's only one or two, I think, yellow countries are people that have signed the convention but maybe haven't ratified it. Obviously, you also notice that there are a bunch of gray countries. Those are countries that have not signed the Convention on Genocide. That means that they don't recognize the international laws for it. And if you think about some of the places where we know that some horrific examples of genocide have taken place, several of those are in some of the countries that are highlighted in gray on this map. So far we've talked about crimes committed by the government. But obviously, there are a large number of political crimes that you can think of as being committed against the government. And this is a really wide range of behaviors. I mean, the American revolutionaries would be examples of people that were committing crime against the government. But it can be much less extreme than that. Student activists who engage in criminal activities. That would be an example of crime against the government. Even if they don't victimize a member of the government. If you're victimizing, if you're inciting violence against the public of the United States on behalf of kind of a political social agenda, we kind of consider that crimes against the government. Draft dodgers were thought of back in the 1970s and 60s as people who were committing crimes against the government because they were essentially not acknowledging this law that had been put into place by the government, saying that if your number came up, you were drafted into the army. So again, what we're talking about here are activities that are not sanctioned. Obviously, there are a lot of student action groups. There are a lot of, people who would consider themselves, activists who aren't necessarily committing any crimes. We're only talking about here people who take these activities to the extreme. And, technically you can kind of think of them as radical activities, but it doesn't tend to be the case that all crimes against the government are people from any one particular ideology. There are politically liberal and conservative groups out there that you can think of examples of groups within that are committing crimes against the government. Examples of extremely politically liberal groups would be maybe some more extremist civil rights groups back in the 1970s and 80s, fighting against racism. Feminists, some more of the extreme feminist movement organizations fighting against sexist treatment. On the more conservative side, obviously, recently, people who are extremely anti-abortion, anti-immigration, those tend to fall on kind of the politically conservative spectrum. So my point is there's a wide variety of people who you can fit into this category. Not all of these groups, again, resort in violence, but some of them obviously do. So when you think about some of the social movements that get involved, some of the social movements that get involved in political social activities, they maintain a fairly non-violent, non-confrontational way of getting their point across. They hold protests, demonstrations, they go on strike. Not everything that they do is criminal. It's when they border on and kind of get into criminal, violent, etc. behavior that they become, political crimes against the government. The real key that you should think about here is a lot of these groups who we would fit into this category are people who have some kind of a desire or commitment to change what's going on in this country in some way, changing the status quo about something. So, when you think about some examples of this, groups that I've already talked about, civil rights extremist groups, feminist groups, immigration, anti or pro-immigration groups, all of those could be examples of groups that maybe some factions of them, to some extremes, have on occasion taken their behavior to the criminal level. So one of the more famous recent examples of a group that at times has bordered on being a group committing political crimes against the government would be the Occupy movement. So when you think about what this thing is, this Occupy movement that has taken force in this country over the past year, it's something that began last year, right around September 27th was when Occupy Wall Street really officially began, and very quickly spread throughout the United States and actually to a lot of cities internationally as well. We're not the only place where this extreme recession has hit. So think about for a second what this movement means to you guys. If I were in a class with you guys right now, I would ask you, what is the Occupy movement's purpose? What is their mission? If you actually go on their website and look at it and look up what their mission is, They talk about fighting back against the corrosive power of major banks and multinational corporations over the democratic process, and the role of Wall Street in creating an economic collapse that has caused the greatest recession in generations. So that's word for word their mission statement, taken from the Occupy movement's main page, at least the one in DC. The idea being this is a group of people that believes that they represent the majority of America who has extremely been hurt by big corporation, by bank regulation, by the 1% that control kind of business and commerce for them. And they want to get some of that back. They want a little bit more equal footing. That's at least what I think they're trying to kind of say there. Their aim is to kind of expose how the richest 1% of people are writing rules of an unfair kind of global economy. That's essentially the idea. So, what I want you to think about for a second, think about some things that you know that the Occupy movement, people working on behalf of it, have done in the past couple months. And are they committing political crimes? Really think about that for a second. Are they committing political crimes, or have they ever? Maybe not all the time, but they're definitely kind of towing the line. When they camp out in parks peacefully, that's not technically really illegal. But when you think about it, I mean, it is illegal to camp in a public park. It's just not something that, for the most part, ever gets enforced. So, what's been happening with the Occupy movement is they're basically challenging the police to enforce this law that they have amassed enough people in parks all over the place to basically exhaust the police's resources and ability to challenge their right to be there. But, the encampments aren't the only place where they've kind of towed the law between committing and not committing some crimes. So, to give you an example, recently the Occupy K Street, DC kind of faction of the Occupy movement liberated, in their words, this empty city-owned school building that used to be called Franklin School. I've got a little picture of it on the right side of the slide. So this school was closed for several years and initially reopened as a homeless shelter. Despite widespread public opposition, the city government decided to close the shelter, and they were about to sell it for it to become condominiums. Well, the Occupy movement decided to move in and basically take over this building because they didn't want that to happen. So technically that's crime. That's a crime that they're committing to put forth this political, social agenda. So in that way, you can kind of think of them as political criminals. But there are also a lot of ways that the Occupy movement is very different from some of the other kind of social movements. For one, the Occupy movement, one reason why it was able to be so successful over time is it's one of the first kind of big social movements like this that really utilized social networking and kind of online organization. It's a very organized group using websites, schedules. They have, if you go on to the Occupy DC's website, they have daily agendas and forums and discussions. So, in a way, they're different in that they're a very organized, fairly peacefully assembled group of people for a really long time. But they're also upset with a huge, powerful force in our country and are trying to make their frustrations heard, sometimes blatantly disobeying, violating laws. So in that way, you can kind of think of it as, in some ways, kind of some of what they're doing as political crime. Just kind of depends on your point of view. If you're somebody who agrees with and stands behind what the Occupy movement is fighting for, you probably don't see what they're doing as bad or criminal at all. There are obviously people who feel very strongly on both sides of it. So some other kind of hot current movements that, again, groups within them tend to toe the line and sometimes move into being what I would call political criminals would be groups like extremist anti-immigration movement. Obviously, we have some very violent examples in the past couple of years of people who engage in acts of violence on behalf of this movement, not wanting to let so many people into this country, wanting people who are here illegally to be shipped out, to be deported. A lot right now, what's going on, a lot of heavy debate is whether, children who are born in this country of illegal immigrants have a right to stay. All of these questions are very contentious, and there are people that feel very strongly on both sides of it. Where it gets into becoming political crime is when people on either side of the movement act violently against the other group on behalf of it. The legalization of marijuana is also a movement that has kind of been trying anyway to gather force around the United States. And people's primary way of kind of putting forth this idea, not only in trying to enact legislation, but it's just to blatantly violate laws against the sale, possession, use of marijuana. And finally, the Tea Party movement, which, some people think of the entire movement as kind of an extremist group. Other people just see individuals within the Tea Party movement as occasionally engaging in acts of political crime. And if it's, again, you have to think about this in terms of what is the motivation behind the criminal acts that they are engaging in. So for the Tea Party movement, kind of a populist political movement, generally kind of recognized as conservative, libertarian group. In and of itself, not a political criminal organization. And, what it was very influential in doing, at least in, the past couple years, has been sponsoring protests and supporting political candidates coming from its movement to try to get them into government positions. It's endorsing really reduced government spending, really opposing taxation in varying degrees. And again, that in and of itself isn't a political crime, but what people are doing because of the movement, based on their allegiance to the movement, is refusing to pay taxes. Because according to them, the laws that are in place that are trying to tax them, they completely disagree with. Think back to the Boston Tea Party. The reason that this group is named the way it is, they don't recognize the laws taxing them at the moment to be valid, so they are disregarding them. Or some people within the group, anyway, are disregarding them. It's an example of people within a movement that are engaging in what you could call political crime. Doesn't have to be violent, but it's a type of political crime.